Thank you very much. Many thanks to Angela McRobbie, Lindsay Balfour, Gary Hall, Adrian Evans and Olga Baker for organising this event. I'm really delighted to be here this evening and I very much appreciate all your hard work. The talk is entitled Personal Value in Personal Subjects, and there are 7 short sections and then an even shorter conclusion. So 1, genres of intimacy. In the preface to the female complaint, Lauren Ballant writes, previous versions of this preface narrated how emotionally thorny it was to write this book. I wrote of myself and of women in my particular family, from Lena to Sadie to Mara and Cindy, who entered femaleness at different historical moments, and yet whose styles of being in femininity have contained uncanny similarities. As you can imagine, such resonances raised intensities of attachment, love, protectiveness, gratitude, disappointment, despair, anger and resentment that created obstacles to livesome storytelling. But then Ballant writes, a friend not from the humanities asked, why are you airing your personal business here? Isn't your knowledge the point? But for Ballant, the autobiographical isn't the personal. And as they put it, this non-intuitive phrase is a major presupposition of the female complaint. They write, the narratives here are read as autobiographies of collective experience. The personal is general. Publics presume intimacy. In this revised preface, we see Ballant's characteristically smart double move. Femininity is declared a social genre. These women entered femaleness, had similar styles of being in femininity. As we are drawn into the intimate register of the autobiographical without anything personal actually having been disclosed. In naming the women in their family history, from Lena and Sadie to Mara and Cindy, and the intensities of attachment writing about them had provoked, love, protectiveness, gratitude, disappointment, despair, anger, and resentment, the reader gains a sense of the emotional thorniness of the experience of writing the book without ever having read the original preface that's being described. Its absence serves to mark out the zone of the intimate as a space that could be filled by anybody's story, thus making it generic. Ballant enacts something that grounds the conceptual premise of the book. The citation of the feminine genre raises the expectation of intimacy grounded in disclosure, even when the stories themselves are withheld. It is their generic conventions that hold this promise. And Ballant is right, as so often, the autobiographical is the general, to the extent that one is entering into an intimate public governed by generic expectations. Ballant writes, an intimate public is an achievement. Whether linked to women or other non-dominant people, it flourishes as a porous, affective sense of identification amongst strangers that promises a certain experience of belonging and provides a complex consolation, confirmation, discipline, and discussion about how to live as an ex. By intimate publics, Ballant is not referring to a sphere constituted through autobiographical confession, nor pointing to the claims of an identity politics that make the personal trump pretty much anything else in the neoliberal appropriation of a 1970s feminist politics, which sought to transform at a structural level those forms of micro-misogyny identified by the new vocabularies collectively produced through the self-exploration of consciousness raising. Instead, Ballant is pushing us to examine how we might be inscribed in intimate publics with strangers through the generic promises of affective gendered identifications. I begin this talk with Ballant because my title, Personal Value in Personal Subjects, takes their work as one of my prompts. It is impossible to be concerned with the relationship between feminist politics and the history of genres of femininity and not feel read by Ballant in a way that is both exhilarating and exposing. Ballant's challenge to the second wave lies in feminism's implication in the individualization, circulation, and commodification of the personal in forms of cultural and political citizenship in these neoliberal times. My title points to the valuing and valorization of the so-called personal, both as intellectual trope and as a socially, culturally, and politically privileged register. In his 2017 article on impersonal feminism, which draws on Ballant, Christian Heinz claims that, in short, neoliberalism conflates the private, the personal, and capital with value as such. It collapses subjectivity into a quasi-asocial void, marginalizing social relations that would exceed the individualistic dimensions of the market and the nation state. For Heinz, we have witnessed a lateral move in which the gestures of the 60s repeats itself, as he put it, only by becoming displaced and intensified. In redirecting our attention away from identity as the assumed basis of politics, he offers a revised slogan: it is the impersonal that is political. It is in this context that Heinz understands the work of third wave feminism, queer theory, affect studies, and biopolitical discourses, amongst other critical movements in the humanities, which, he argues, reignite the political energies of the 60s, not by mimicking them, but rather by locating politics on the other side of the personal in the production of subjectivity. But how exactly can we understand the production of subjectivity as located on the other side of the personal? And how does the impersonal register, if at all, in the autobiographical materials of feminist theorizing? 2, telling stories. During my PhD on British women's memories of Hollywood stars in the 1940s and 1950s in cultural studies at the University of Birmingham, I was interested in the memory work of feminist photographers Jo Spence and Rosie Martin, and of writers such as Gail Lewis in Truth, Dare or Promise, 1985, Carolyn Steedman in Landscape for a Good Woman in 1986, and Valerie Walker-Dean in Video Replay, Families, Films and Fantasies in 1986. This work used autobiographical material to explore the economic, cultural and social formations, not only of gender, but also of race and class. And although auto theory had yet to be named and branded as such, there was something akin to it circulating in the feminist work at this time, something aware of the problems with the discourse of the personal, which pushed towards a more historicized and culturally located conceptualization of subjectivity. As Annette Kuhn elaborated so eloquently in Family Secrets, Acts of Memory and Imagination in 1995, there is little that is really personal or private about either family photographs or the memories they invoke. Memory work was only one form of rethinking the personal register at this time, but it was an influential one. Inspired by some of these writers, I began my PhD, which became Stargazing, with a short reading of 3 images. The first was a snapshot of myself at age 17 in 1976 at a 1950s party, wearing my mother's white strapless dress that she made for herself in the early 1950s. The dress required a corset to pull the waist into the appropriate size to fit the tight, whaleboned bodice above the full, stiffly petticoated skirt. I was surprised my mother needed a corset, as she often told me that in her 20s, she had a 22-inch waist, something my friends, I later gathered, had also been told by their mothers, a generic claim then. Here is a short excerpt from what I wrote. The scene is a 1950s party held in the 1970s. Full dresses, long jacketed suits, American teenagers and barbecued hot dogs. I'm standing on the left in an outfit borrowed from my mother, who was in her 20s in the 1950s. The pearls and pink wool and stole, here shown obviously only in black and white, which were also my mother's, and they countered the hints of American brashness or even sexual availability. All the other accessories, including the frosted pink lipstick and nail varnish and the drop pearl earrings, were mine. Very mid-1970s suburban Bromley. The combination of these accessories with the dress produced a particularly white middle-class British version of glamour. The whiteness of the dress evokes associations of an innocence, a sexual or perhaps racial purity. This complements the pink of the lips, nails and stole, a colour associated with feminine gentleness and softness. The image here rests on a bid for glamour, tempered by British middle-class restraint and respectability. My reading of this snapshot was followed by a discussion of an advertisement for Lux soap featuring film star Susan Hayward, which makes a direct connection between whiteness and purity. And I quote, "Much as Susan may change character, one thing remains familiar, that fabulous complexion, because she's never changed her mind about her choice of the whitest soap, Lux toilet soap. It's the snowy white look that tells you worlds about purity." 9 out of 10 stars use pure white Lux toilet soap. The final of the 3 readings was of a Cindy Sherman portrait. The stylized pose, expression, costume and makeup of the photograph was read through the generic conventions of femininity as image. When my mother requested a copy of the book after its publication and read the opening pages, I suspect she never got any further. She told me I was quite wrong about her white dress. It was nothing to do with purity, sexual, racial or otherwise. It was simply that in those days, when rationing was still continuing in Britain, the only choice was black and white cotton, as it was cheaper. Black would have been too funereal, she told me. So she, like her friends, had chosen white. At the time, I'm sure I dismissed her response, probably ridiculing it to my peers, as a way of distancing myself from her refusal to engage with the terms of my project. In her view, of course, I had failed to engage with the terms of her project. For her, these decisions about dress materials were economic practicalities, free from the kinds of ideological charge I was implying. Thinking about it now, I'm struck that it was my mother and not I who brought the material conditions, the cost, the availability, the lack of choices, to bear on the reading of the photograph of her borrowed dress. My mother, always ridiculed in my family for her ignorance, on this occasion sternly pointed out mine. The intergenerational dynamics of my repurposing of 1950s feminine glamour get rerouted here by the original owner, my mother, as a wrongful narration. I'll return to this term, wrongful narration, towards the end of my talk. Suffice it to say for now that it was my mother who brought the impersonality of the autobiographical to the table, where I had failed to do so. 3, impersonal language. The impersonal subjects of my title refer not only to Belant, but also to Denise Riley's important 2005 essay collection, Impersonal Passion, Language as Affect. For Riley, language itself is impersonal. Its working through and across us is indifferent to us, yet in the same blow, it constitutes the fabric of the personal. This points to a paradox that seems to trip us up, even when we try and tread carefully to hold the impersonality of the autobiographical I at the heart of our conceptual and compositional frames. My reading of femininity as generic trope, for example, perhaps revealed my wish for the problem of whiteness to reside in my mother's generation rather than my own. Riley reminds us, and I quote, "The business of being named and taking on a social category both come from the outside. Both are externally given at the heart of a supposed inwardness. If an indifferent language constitutes the fibre of the personal, thereby guaranteeing the impersonality of our self-narrations, then its promise is foreclosed from the outset. But as Riley writes, and not without compassion, the outwardly given received idea has to be made mine, to be interiorized. I'm just noticing that, there we are, has to be interiorized. As if I had summoned it up as my own creation in order for it to live. It's through the ventriloquy of inner speech that this has happened. Since the I is deictic, only ever meaningful, alongside extra-linguistic information, it instantiates the indifference stroke intimacy of language that Riley is talking about here. In her account, Riley conceptualizes language's affect as the outward unconscious, which hovers between people rather than swimming upward from the privacy of each heart. This outward unconscious, which hovers between people, is what is so elusive. And yet without such a conceptual framing, we lose the psychodynamics of social relations that matter so much politically, as both Ballant and Riley demonstrate. To apprehend that our inner voices proceed from elsewhere, like a kind of ventriloquism, is not merely to shift from an individualized notion of subjectivity to a more relational one, as in the subject's relation to another, and neither is it a matter of simply replacing the subject with concepts such as intersubjectivity or relationality. The conceptual change being demanded here is more to sustain the notion of the impersonality of subjectivity in the ways we approach the autobiographical material of shifting social and cultural formations. Some have called this the psychosocial. Others, such as Ballant and Riley, have written the unconscious into the theoretical vocabularies and moves, whether named or unnamed. We could ask, how might non-fictional writing do what literature seems to achieve so effortlessly, communicate subjectivity not in the first person, or not necessarily? Self-conjugated plurals. This conceptualization of the subject of autobiographical material that is located beyond the I is quite different from what Carolyn Laubender has identified as the appeal of the plural self of recently branded auto theory, where the self and other are reconfigured as collaborative and cumulative, as she writes. Laubender offers a critical reading of the desire behind the plural self for a contemporary generation of artists and academics well-schooled in neoliberals' alleged trappings. In her article in the 2020 special issue of the Arizona Quarterly on auto theory, edited by Robin Wiegman, Laubender cautions against what she identifies as, and I quote, a wish for an ethico-political form of self-writing as a counterpoint to the persistent hegemony of liberal individualism. Laubender is skeptical about the reparative moves of the ethico-political claims of the plural self. Laubender writes, one of my abiding suspicions here is that in its refusal of both conventional autobiographical and psychoanalytic styles of self-narration, auto theory enacts a wish for the ethico-political form of self-writing, not bound up with the reproduction of neoliberal individualism's violences. Laubender analyses in particular the polyphonic self in Maggie Nelson's much lauded book, The Argonauts. She quotes Nelson from an interview thus, I'm always looking for terms that are not memoir, Nelson says, to describe the autobiographical writing that exceeds the boundaries of the personal. Laubender suggests that the book, The Argonauts, is an ode, and I quote, an ode to how self-identity can only ever be constituted through the self's relation to another. Nelson achieves this, she argues, partly through the use of deconstructive formalist techniques, like editing in italicized text from other writers and citing theorists and friends in the margins, and also partly through the way in which the book chronicles, and I quote, Nelson's relationship with her lover, Harry, Harry's gender transition, and her own pregnancy, end quote. But for Lavender, in focusing specifically on the ethico-political aspects of interrelationality, Nelson's text constructs a narrative avatar that is a non-singular persona, a self conjugated in the plural, which circumvents the problem of the unconscious by reaching for the reparative. Circumvents the problem of the unconscious by reaching for the reparative. For me, the Argonauts articulated the invested narrations of its first-person plural protagonist precisely by navigating and narrating the blind spots of the I from the outside, from the point of view of another. In this way, Nelson offers the reader a take on her own desires from behind her self-narrations. The identification with Nelson's I, then, insists that the reader considers how we are all implicated in more or less worthy ethical positions. Having said this, there is still an outstanding desire for the authority of experience here, as in the distinction between this happened and this could have happened, to borrow from Samuel Delany. Prompted by Nelson's use of Winnicott's Good Enough Mother, my own reading of the Argonauts sought to push against the deferential fandom that characterized the psychic life of its reception by arguing that the good enough reader might be the one who resists the temptation to idealize both the book and its author. But Lavender's diagnosis is compelling. This pluralized self in search of reparation avoids an encounter with the non-sovereignty of relationality itself. With what Ballant and Lee Edelman in Sex or the Unbearable would call the constitutive division that keeps us as subjects from fully knowing or being in control of ourselves, and that prompts our misrecognition of our own motives and desires. Having read Lavender's critique, I'm now even more convinced that being the good enough reader of the Argonauts involves finding reassurance in that avoidance. That is, standing on the ethico-political and thus right side of the line with Nelson, despite the moments when she undoes that assumed solidarity. Five, doubleness. One way, and certainly not the only one, to push towards whatever we imagine sits on the other side of that line is to take a direction that veers away from being the good self-knowing subject, or even or especially when we can read our own fault lines. In a dialogue with Honor Gavin at the 2020 Sexuality Summer School on Queering the Archive, Geordie Rosenberg states that we might pause on what has happened to autobiography in the recent context of the rise of memoir and autofiction. I have questions, he says, in regard to the rise of memoir and autofiction about the remaindering of the question of autobiography. We don't use that word so much anymore. So as a category, I wonder what has become of autobiography, because it so much more demands that one includes the question of history and one's relation to it. If autobiography has been remaindered through the rise of memoir and autofiction, as Rosenberg argues, how might its continued historicizing forms enable subjectivity to be narrated impersonally? How might we think about reading autobiographical material through a kind of doubleness that brings history into critical tension with psychic investments? In her 2009 article, Birthing Racial Difference, Conversations with My Mother and Others in Studies in the Maternal, Gail Lewis writes of her childhood attachment to asking her mother repeatedly to read aloud the end of Alice in Wonderland. Written as a dialogue with her white mother, Lewis begins by exploring the apparent irony that the social figure of Alice, the little girl with the long blonde hair, blue eyes, white skin, and middle-class comforts, the irony that she should provide the ground upon which the psychic dramas produced by my experience of being mothered were in part played out. The repetition of the end of the story, as she interprets it, articulates the profound psychic uncertainty I had about my mother's presence. Lewis's attachment was to the structural repetitions not self-evident in conscious social identifications based on identity categories. She writes, whether a children's story, a scholarly text, or a small musical clip, cultural artifacts symbolize a double movement, simultaneously materializing social life in the meanings that condense around them, while also having the potential to become the object cathexis across which an individual's psychic dramas are manifest. Lewis argues that these cultural artifacts are paradoxical, since in this doubleness or performance of doubleness, there need not be any necessary mirroring between the individual's social self and her psychic truth. The identifications and projections explored here uncouple the assumed match between the social subject located in history via identity categories and the phantasmatic psychic investments of cultural attachments. As Lewis writes, in the realm of the unconscious, as in the world of politics, there is no necessary belonging. Lewis interweaves these memories with quotations from racist texts of the time. One is a secret note that Major General Arthur Arnold Bullock Dowler wrote in 1942, which is reprinted in full in West Indian Women at War. He warned against white women mixing with Black American troops. And I quote, "White women should not associate with coloured men. It follows then they should not walk out, dance, or drink with them. Do not think such action hard or unsociable. They do not expect your companionship, and such relations would only end in strife." Lewis connects this text back to Thomas Carlyle's racist discourses about racial purity and separation in the 1850s, detailed in Catherine Hall's 2002 study of public discourses about racial difference in civilizing subjects. These historical discourses are introduced conversationally to ground her mother's own racism in the multiple potential contexts of its formation. So much of her relationship with her mother was, as Lewis put it, choreographed through the social, familial, and psychic meanings accorded to the differences in our skin. Addressing the figure of her late mother directly in the second person, Lewis writes, "What did all that stuff at the level of the state mean for us? For Major General Arthur Arnold surely circled us. But there was more, wasn't there? I mean, it wasn't just the state and its representative voices that created moments of racial distance and despair. I mean, you never really stopped telling me about how you never stopped paying for having me and Lorraine, your Black children. Were you echoing Major General Arthur Arnold Bullock Dowler and saying that such relations would only end in strife? I know I was sure for so long that I ruined your life." And then, with a shift in perspective that allows for maternal ambivalence towards her, Lewis continues, "I mean, when you had to gather up all your inner strength so as to be prepared for another sneer, another comment, yet another demonstration of what people known to you or not thought of you and your Black children, thought of you for having Black children, how your father and brother claimed you brought shame and disgrace on the family and on them, how others cast you as sexually depraved and morally bankrupt, how your ability to be a good enough mother was called into doubt." And then shifting to the more recent past, she writes, imagine that a Black man did become the President of the United States of America. 30 years after we sat and watched that other African-American man, Arthur Ashe, come out onto the leafy lawns of oh so white and middle class and English Wimbledon and win the men's singles finals. What Lewis narrates here is not the self-conjugated in the plural of auto theory's promise of the ethico-political subject, to cite Lavender again. Instead, she restages her white mother's maternal ambivalence from the point of view of the Black daughter's retrospection, by refracting it through a parallel account of the history of wartime and post-war racism in Britain. Lewis, now a psychoanalytic psychotherapist and academic, uses associative methods, the might have been of racist discursive causation, to map the scene of ambivalent intimacies born of the violent histories of racism in Britain and its colonies. This is the writing of doubling, of that which is partially incommensurate with and in excess of what can be mapped and traced but can't be restored through the telling. Borrowing from Ballant and Edelman, we might call this the staging of the scene of relationality. 6, relationality itself. In Sex or the Unbearable, Ballant and Edelman claim that relationality always includes a scenic component, a phantasmatic staging. It puts into play reaction, accommodation, transference, exchange, and the articulation of narratives. The term phantasmatic brings more than fantasy to the table. It is a placeholder for the illusory in our dealings with each other and with the world. This opens up the question of how we hold apart the "this happened" of auto theory and the "this could have happened" of literature, film, or other cultural forms. The phantasmatic staging emphasizes the scenic component of relationality, a phrase in which we hear Ballant's commitment to theorizing the psychic dimensions of social genres and Edelman's more Lacanian emphasis. Writing of sex, they offer an account of the relations that both overwhelm and anchor us, and of a relationality invested with hopes, expectations, anxieties that are often experienced as unbearable. Herein lies their refusal of the sovereign subject, and here I'll give a slightly longer version of what I quoted earlier. Non-sovereignty invokes the psychoanalytic notion of the subject's constitutive division that keeps us as subjects from knowing or being fully in control of ourselves, and that prompts our misrecognition of our motives and desires. To encounter ourself as non-sovereign is to encounter relationality itself, in the psychic, social, and political senses of the term. End quote. And if sex is their focus here, much of this conceptual framework can be extended well beyond it to our affective socialities more generally. If autobiographical material always constructs invested narratives, then the stories we tell are charged with unconscious desires and projections, which form the scene of relationality. And because these narratives are told to others, the mutually projected fantasies of self and other are necessarily already in play. We are imbricated in that endless relay of relational projections, the telling stories that tell tales on us. Recognitions are accompanied by misrecognitions, and any sense of the transparency of ourselves to each other as subjects is likely to reveal misapprehensions when the pressure is on. These condensed psychic processes are indicative of the unpredictable ways that affect is mutually constitutive and that we are always subject to others. 7, wrongful narration. And this is the final section before a very short conclusion. A few years ago, I was invited to contribute to Porous Boundaries, a festschrift for Janet Wolfe, my friend, co-editor and colleague who was retiring from the University of Manchester. I knew immediately what I wanted to write about, the tension between Janet's celebration of philosophical and aesthetic uncertainty, which I had greatly admired, and her precision, which sometimes manifested itself in an insistent satisfaction of getting it right. I was fascinated by this contradiction between her commitment to intellectual uncertainty and her affective attachment to what happened. I took my prompt from her 2008 book, The Aesthetics of Uncertainty. For Janet, uncertainty provides a hopeful entry into the spaces of dialogue in the context of political tendencies towards the opposite. Alongside this, I connected her chapter on colour mainly blue from her then unpublished digressive memoir, Austerity Baby, in which she reflects back on the histories that form the contours and spaces of her own life through stories about other people. Beginning with the many associations of blue and moving to its complement orange, for reasons which will become apparent, the chapter ends with a consideration of the colour produced when the two are combined, grey. Embracing the artist Gerhard Richter's commitment to grey as a refusal or blending of colour that speaks indirectly to the problem of moral imperatives in the viewer, Janet pushes her readers to consider the significance of this colour in times of fundamentalism and intransigence. In this chapter, Janet returns to the late Tim Guest's memoir, My Life in Orange. They had lived in the same shared house when he was a young boy, during the time his mother wore orange as a sign of belonging to the Bagwan community. Whilst admiring this memoir, Janet goes into considerable empirical detail to correct Guest's account of this house in which they had both lived. It couldn't have been this way, she writes, because of that. And it couldn't have been that way because of this. In my chapter, I was interested in Janet's slight irritation at what we might call Guest's wrongful narration of their shared house. This reminded me of my own response when I had chanced upon an article in which I myself had not only been wrongfully narrated, but had actually been erased from someone else's personal narrative. The story went on to form the basis of some general philosophical claims. I had become the structuring absence of someone else's autobiographical material used to explore cultural theory. I had become a missing person. Suddenly, the subject who writes of absence and ambiguity demands to be fully present and correct. Much like Janet's return to the bricks and mortar, to the design and layout of the shared house in Leeds, I found myself unable to stop rehearsing the actual details of the events missing from the said narrative. In absent-minded moments, I found myself drawn back to the retelling of this story with me in it. I imagined correcting the author when or if we next spoke. It is one thing for Janet to decenter herself in her own oblique memoir, but I had been erased by the narrator from a story of events that could never have taken place without me. I was filled with self-righteous outrage and moral certainty. Where was my commitment to the scene of relationality now? In this context, the criminal connotations of the term wrongful narration appealed to me. Like wrongful arrest, it suggests an injustice that invites protest. Emotional certainty surfaces most forcefully in me at these moments. Doubt disappears, and what feels like a theft or trespass generates the more solid ground of conviction in both senses of the word. My best psychoanalytic inclinations give way to a possessive version of personal narrative, to its authenticity and veracity. My commitment to the invested narration of the scene of relationality dissolves in a second in the face of my outrage about having been wrongfully narrated. This was a time of emotional reckoning. But as I sit there full of the satisfactions of self-righteousness and think about this tension between Janet's and my own attachment to intellectual uncertainty and emotional certainty at the time of having been wrongfully narrated, my mother's dress flashes into my mind. My mother had also felt wrongly narrated, as I did now, when she read my story about her dress in Stargazing. A sobering moment deflates my injured and inflamed ego. I glimpse that beautifully handmade dress that she had so generously trusted to me that evening. Little did she know what trespass I would enact in its name. But unlike me, there's no speaking back to the wrongful narration of the dress. Her story will remain untold and unheard. As she so often said to me when she was alive, when I was growing up in the 1930s and 1940s, I was told children should be seen and not heard. Then, when I was a mother in the 1960s and 70s, young people were the ones who thought they knew best. It was all about teenagers, and our views were considered just old hat. My generation, she told me, was the one that nobody ever really wanted to listen to. Conclusion, erasures. To draw this to a close, we might note that the protest against erasure takes the form of "this couldn't have happened" in Janet's because of the material layout of the house, and in my own without me. For my mother, the protest was against an appropriation of her handmade dress in the service of political critique. Lewis's account introduces a doubleness that opens the gap between the transparency of social identity categories and the psychic identifications with fictional scenarios, between structural repetitions and associative methods. If my reaction to becoming the structuring absence of someone else's wrongful narration produced an insistence on the authenticity of events, on what couldn't have happened, then we might think of this as an intellectual manifestation of the return of the repressed. The impersonal I of autobiographical material is suddenly replaced by my claim to the authenticity of presence. What is exposed here is the ongoingness of a tension between intellectual affiliation and affective attachments. That, it seems, she sighs, still requires yet more working through.